Welcome to The Missing Link, a podcast where crypto and insurance come together. I'm Dan Roberts, and my co-host is Danielle Wall-Elliott. Whether you're in crypto, traditional finance, or in need of a new podcast, The Missing Link will help you explore the vital role that insurance plays in crypto and how blockchain will disrupt insurance. Join us on our journey to find the missing link. Hello everyone, welcome to The Missing Link. Today we have founder of Synthetix, Kain Warwick. He takes us through the trends and phases of Synthetix governance and decentralization in general, talks about the chaos and the rubies in the rubble that are really starting to take hold in the space, and he ends with great sentiment over the state of the market and the missing link that might have already arrived, which is a new one. So it was a really great, engaging conversation, and we hope you enjoy.
All right, episode 3. I'm excited about this one. Today we have Kain Warwick joining us on the podcast. I've heard Kain described as a founder of DeFi, and more specifically as the founder of Synthetix. Synthetix allows people to hold tokens that give them price exposure to real-world assets. Synthetix is open source, and the protocol is community-owned. Today we have a truly global conversation happening from Australia, the UK, and the US. So Kain, thank you for joining us today and spending some time with us. First off, I wanted to ask you, how do you describe Synthetix today, and maybe how has that changed?
Yeah, I think, today Synthetix is more of like infrastructure than it once was. So originally Synthetix was a stablecoin platform. And the stablecoin and the kind of use case of like payments was the sort of totality of the project. And then over time, as we've evolved, we went from this Haven stablecoin to Synthetix, and then Synthetix V2X, and then now Synthetix V3. Synthetix has kind of faded further and further into the background, and is now kind of facilitating other projects to, tap into liquidity and build different interesting financial instruments.
And what do you tell people your role is, since it is more community owned? Do you just say, community participant, still just founder?
I mean, I'm still the founder. I guess they can never take that away from me, but like I get to always be the founder. But I think in some ways, founder does kind of, it's evolved over time, this title of founder, right? To like kind of almost imply like a sense of control. So I do think that there is, like something that like is a bit kind of misaligned there, right? I don't want to give the false impression that I have any control of Synthetix, because I really don't. Particularly over the last 6 months, once I was no longer on the governance council, I really, from a day-to-day perspective, sometimes people will be like, hey, can I like tell you what I'm doing? But it's very kind of one directional. It's them telling me what they're doing rather than me sort of saying, hey, why don't you guys try this or do something else.
Nice. Well, another thing we like to start off with each of our guests is just to kind of get them to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10. What's your crypto knowledge and what's your insurance knowledge?
So I think, Dan and I had this conversation maybe the first time that we caught up, right? I have a weird, every once in a while you like get forced to kind of do something which gives you like some weird knowledge that you really shouldn't have, right? About how like something works in the world. You go down a rabbit hole or you have some project that like requires you to do something. And back in like 2015, when we were in the process of rolling out Blue Shift, I went down this insurance rabbit hole. Because it was weird kind of insurance around gaming outcomes, but like we ended up having conversations with people at like Lloyd's, and it was just a whole weird thing. I've forgotten 95% of it, I'm sure, but like I do have like a weird. So I would say I'll give myself like a 3 on insurance, maybe. And then crypto, I don't know. Like I would have said, back in the day that I was probably a 9 out of 10, but I might be like a 7.5 these days. There's a lot of stuff that I haven't caught up with in the last like year. So the bear market's for catching up on the latest stuff.
Yeah, not just for building, for learning too.
Yes, yeah, or relearning in my case.
Yeah, I feel like if you think you've lost 95% of your insurance knowledge and it's still a 3, that puts you up at a pretty strong, like 97 or something originally out of 10.
Yeah, I was. I mean, look, who knows, right? Like, there was probably a 3-month period where like I knew a lot about like what was going on in underwriting and who the players were and everything. But yeah, definitely that knowledge has evaporated over the last like 8 years. So
most people's insurance knowledge arises from it being forced upon them. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Amazing. Well, yeah, very, very cool to have you on. Thank you again. I think my interest is, the crypto space, we've been saying for a long time, hasn't been around for a super long time, but it's, it's certainly going through its different phases of maturity. And Synthetix is, I would say, is one of the, longer staple names in the space. And so was keen to understand how you have navigated the various bull and bear markets and the various trends that have come and gone over the duration of your time, and particularly keen to maybe dive into a bit of the governance piece as you guys operate a DAO and have gone through all of those challenges as well. So have you seen very distinct phases over the duration of the Synthetix project?
I think we have, but I also think that DeFi, and Synthetix as part of DeFi has sort of been a little bit out of phase with, some of the more like macro cycles. So like we had DeFi Summer, which yesterday on Twitter was pointed out to me was not in 2019, it's actually in 2020. So it shows how good my memory is. But 2019 for Synthetix was a big year, where for, macro crypto, right, it was pretty dead. And that was the case for a lot of the OG DeFi projects. There was this kind of like weeding out of a lot of the like weird stuff that didn't make any sense, and what was left was kind of DeFi. There was some identity stuff, there was some gaming stuff, some NFT stuff, like early stuff in that direction. But really, the majority of the projects that like continued building through that bear market were DeFi projects. And so then you had this kind of like I guess resurgence of interest from people who were still in crypto in 2019 and 2020. But then by 2021, that had kind of faded, and the Alt-1 thesis and NFTs and games kind of reached an ascendancy again. And so I do think that we have had this kind of weird relationship where like, yeah, you feel the bear markets, but they can sometimes feel a little bit out of sync with the rest of crypto.
Yeah. I feel like on the governance side, I remember a long post that you did about essentially a suggestion of how the DAO could operate, and your strong opinions on the way that it should. But it was quite new to people getting into the DeFi mindset around that time. To see, as you say, a founder being just another voice in the room or in the community. Are you able to how have you seen the governance challenges evolve over time? We've seen some success stories in the space, but they still, are subject to, significant challenges in operating decentralized governance. There are still new, models and attempts at getting that right. How's the governance piece evolved for Synthetix over time as your involvement has decreased?
I think when you look at governance or any kind of experimentation, right? And governance within DeFi or within crypto projects is an ongoing experiment. It is kind of easy to look at a small sample size and draw, some overly broad conclusions. And I think that definitely happened a little bit, right? And it's also easy to kind of overreact and overcorrect and be like, oh, wow, this is really not working. We need to go in a different direction. And I think on some level, if you try to change the way that something works, right, like a startup or a project, there is inevitably going to be friction. Even if the end state that you're going to get to is going to be better, like look at, and like an acquisition of a startup, right? A startup gets acquired by a larger company. There's a lot of horror stories of that going wrong. But even the ones that are successful, the first 3 months, it's chaos. right? And if you looked at that and, every single time you got 2 months in and you're like, no, shut this thing down, it's not working, then you never get through that kind of, trials of disillusionment or whatever, where you come out the other side and you're like, oh, actually, this is okay. Now, that isn't to say that all of the ways that we've approached decentralized governance within DeFi have been smart or effective or efficient, right? That process of how you do that first 3, 6, 12 months of decentralization is still an open question. And, it's still a problem to be optimized for. But within Synthetix, we had this thing where we kind of hit a wall after about 6 months of like, we'd really decentralized it. We'd like handed over to a council. We've done all this stuff. And the aspect that was sort of left behind were the core contributors. So we went to a core contributor model. I think Synthetix was one of the first crypto projects to kind of rethink, rather than having a team of people that were paid by a centralized entity to say, anyone can be a contributor, but a core contributor is someone who is paid directly by the DAO. And so we've got this DAO that's paying core contributors to do stuff. What the fuck do they do? Is the question then, right? And this is what happened, right? Like we were like, okay, we've got all this stuff and it's working, and we've got a council and community, and everything's being directed, but people need some structure to kind of get them in the right direction, moving in the right direction, coordinate them. And that was the bit that we missed with Synthetix. Now, it would have been easy to just go fail, put the fail stamp on it and go back to centralization. What I did at the time was say, okay, like we really missed this. We thought that, especially coming from Synthetix, there were 8 people, in the early Synthetix, people that kind of got us through that bear market, right? They were all sitting in one room most of the time, and they could all kind of talk to each other. And, there was a level of kind of coordination that just in a small group of people can work really well. And then we went from like 8 to like 25, and it just, fell apart. And so I looked at that and I was like, okay, we got that wrong. We got a lot of stuff right. We got a lot of stuff wrong. Let's go and fix the stuff we got wrong rather than trying to, throw the whole thing out. And we kind of thought through how to improve and make more efficient this process of core contributors. And now the core contributors are genuinely self-organizing. They take inputs from the community in the form of, governance proposals, whatever, and then they output a thing, and it works really well. But it took 2 years and it was very kind of pop dependent and this random walk towards, this efficient process. But I think we've gotten there. Now, does that mean that if you look at Synthetix, you could kind of plot out how to do it for another project? Not necessarily, because I just don't think we have enough data and it's too idiosyncratic. But I think if you look at, 10 projects or 20 projects that have all survived, right? And look at, okay, what was the process that they went through? There's probably some lessons you can start to really, kind of pick out of there. And I think we will develop a bit of a playbook, but it's still very early.
One of those lessons that I learned, I worked at Shapeshift for 6 years and then helped them transition to a DAO. And one of the lessons and the drum that I was beating the loudest is decentralization is not the absence of organization. And I think that, we want to feel like, wow, it's community led. Wow, let's hand over the keys to these token holders. And it's like, no, like we have processes in place. We were such an established company that we didn't need to reinvent the wheel. Let's do what we were doing, but let's have, community members join us in doing it. And so, yeah, I love hearing about just different DAO models and communities and how it takes trial and error. But yeah, if you, like you said, if you wait it out, you're going to have that success.
Yeah,
if you can survive the bear market.
Yeah, if you can survive, you got to survive the bear market. And a bear market is a good time to do this stuff, but it's a little bit like, trying to like switch out the, engines in a plane, while
you're flying the plane.
Right? It's like, well, we only need one and we've got 3. So like, let's, switch out one. And it's like, well, okay, that didn't work out. Now we've got 2 engines. Like, what do we do? So you do need to have some care, obviously, you don't want to crash the plane. But you also don't want to rebuild the plane in its entirety, right? Like you want to actually take what the plane works. You just, switching out some components. So I think that is, that's exactly right. Like you still need organization, but we just didn't have a lot of good examples of what does organization. We had great examples of what chaos looks like. We didn't have good examples of what organization looked like in a decentralized environment. And I think on some level, you almost can only get that looking, post hoc, like you look retrospectively and you're like, oh, that is why that worked. Okay, cool. Now next time I know how to do that better. At the time, you're just like in this, insanity, and you're like trying to survive.
Well, I mean, Danielle, I feel like you say you're not reinventing the wheel, but there is a lot of reinventing going on regardless. And that's not even talking about the Synthetix proposition or whatever, startup and new innovation you're bringing to the market. You're talking about governance, innovation, and doing all that at the same time. It's good to remind everyone from time to time that, you mentioned it's been 2 years, which may seem like an eternity in this market, but it's still, if you imagine another 10, 20 years going by, there's a huge amount of progress to be made. So, congratulations on feeling some of that emerging from the chaos and, seeing some of the fruits of that, headaches and gray hairs coming through, coming to fruition. I guess on the subject, what would you say you're most excited about around Synthetix this year? What are the sort of biggest adoption plays for the protocol in 2023?
I think, as I said, this kind of receding into the background and becoming infrastructure, and sort of seeing that come to fruition, where there's, 10 plus different projects that are leveraging Synthetix now as infrastructure, to the point where you've got like multiple layers and composability actually, at this point, right? So you've got Synthetix as this, kind of base layer liquidity, and then you've got, multiple projects building interfaces, building different, solutions on top of it. And then some of those independent solutions being kind of composed together to create like a third solution, which is pretty amazing to see. And I think that really speaks to the promise of DeFi. Like we definitely saw that, with combinations of, things like AMMs and lending and stuff, through like DeFi summer in 2021 and 2022. But I think the level of complexity of some of those things is really increasing. And the reason for that, I think, is time, but also, computational efficiency, right? We have L2s now that are effective and working. And so you can just do things that were just kind of, not really possible on L1.
That's great.
Yeah. So Synthetix, our take is that the next kind of wave of DeFi is just this idea of tokenization of real world assets and liquid assets. Synthetix allows for tokenized exposure to gold, silver, Bitcoin, euros. How do you see the tokenization of liquid assets or real world assets advancing over the next 12 months?
That is a very good question. And the real world asset question, I guess, is still feels to me like a bit unsolved. There's people talking about like tokenizing treasuries. Now there's yield to be had in the real world. Who would have thought it, right? And how do we get that yield? Real yield in the real world, right? We're not at 0% interest rates anymore, right? So people are like, "Oh, how do we get that into crypto?" Which is, it's hilarious and a bit horrifying, right? It's like, do we need to put a wrapper around treasuries? But on some level, like, yes, not everyone has access to treasuries, and if you look at that as like true risk-free yield, and someone in Bangladesh wants to access a 3-4% yield or whatever, and has stable coins, then okay, cool, maybe that makes sense, and they can hold their money in USD. So there's definitely some stuff where I'm like, okay, this seems like something that has utility. There's still the open question of how do you maintain that utility and kind of decentralization while bringing it on chain without, recreating this like CeFi nightmare that we've sort of seen play out in real time over the last year, and that to me is still kind of an unsolved question because, you're at the mercy of regulators in various jurisdictions, as soon as you touch the real world. Matt Levine talks about this a lot, like this idea of like, okay, you kind of have two paths you can go down. You can, stay as this like, kind of little casino that's self-referential and, doesn't actually do anything, right? But it's really fun and you get to kind of invent cool things, or you can, eventually try and connect yourself to the real world. As soon as you connect yourself to the real world, the real world, it's connected to you, right? Which is, sometimes problematic. So.
Yeah, that hits close to home where we kind of talk about this. We're like, we're a centralized company with, fully regulated, utilizing decentralized, tools and protocols because, we do have this 1 foot in the real world and 1 foot in the crypto world. Next up, I told you I watched a great Chainlink video on you and saw that you've been an entrepreneur for quite some time, from stringing tennis rackets at 15, making, I think you said $50,000 to $100,000 a year. So then, Blue Shift, Haven, and Synthetix. And now as an investor in the space, you're seeing a lot of projects. So are there any specific industries that you're focused on? Is there anything that's most interesting to you and hot right now?
Just, there's nothing that I would say like I'm kind of any more excited about than I was, 6 or 12 months ago, let's say, right? I think in the bear market, you get to kind of see what's real. And so for me, what I'm kind of watching is like, what are the things that are still kind of grinding away? What are the projects that are still grinding away? What are the kind of sectors that are still grinding away doing things? Because, there's a big opportunity. And like people, I think after the FTX collapse, people are like, oh man, this is going to be terrible. There's going to be so much scrutiny on crypto. And there is, but the majority of that scrutiny is really kind of on like the CeFi side of things, right?
Yeah.
And, if you're a small DeFi project that, is kind of grinding away in obscurity at the moment, my argument would be you can kind of get away with whatever you want, right? Like there's really no one, it's going to take a while before we work out, what the full fallout of FTX was, right? And that's going to tie up a lot of attention and cycles from a lot of people. So, if you want to go and innovate now, okay, yeah, you might not have piles of money being dropped on your head, but you might not need piles of money to go and do the thing you want to do. So for me, it's about kind of catching up on all the stuff that happened over the last 2 years. A lot of it's nonsense, but there are, little gems in there. And sort of looking and being like, oh, actually, that's really interesting. What's happening now with it? And then you kind of, sometimes you dig in and you're like, oh, that's actually dead. It was a dead end. And, people kind of gave up once, it was obvious that there was not going to be just, infinite piles of money to go and do whatever nonsense you wanted. And so people tend to stop doing those things. But then you look in some things, you're like, oh, wow, okay, people are still grinding away at that and they're still solving it. It's still going in the right direction.
How do you dig in? Do you join the Discord communities? Do you just look at what the output is?
Yeah. So for me, it's like, starting, we're lucky today in that, you have so many great newsletters, right? Like you've got like the Defiant and the Daily Gwei and, you've got podcasts and all. So oftentimes I'll like see a project or like see something. And kind of my first protocol is like go to their Twitter and be like, okay, what are they talking about? Right. And, if there's like 3 tweets in the last like week and, then usually they'll link out to like a mirror post or something. And you can kind of just like go down that rabbit hole, and sort of see what's going on there. These days, Discord is very hard to manage, right? Like, I actually just got back into the Synthetix Discord for the first time in a few months yesterday. And already I'm like, oh man, I know why I stopped doing this. Like, it's just really challenging. So, occasionally if I'm like, all right, I really want to dig in and I've got a question that is hard to answer, I might jump into a project Discord. But I'm lucky that, if I'm really, really interested, I can usually kind of ping the founders and be like, hey, answer my dumb questions. And they'll be like, sure.
That's great.
Note to self, we need to use Twitter more as well, Danielle.
Yeah, I think the majority of stuff still happens. Twitter is still the public sphere for crypto, right? That's crypto Twitter is still the place.
Dan, get on Twitter. I've told you this.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
I'm sticking to my guns.
So you've insured a few, or reviewed a few insurance plays, names included. Can you just mention on this landscape, crypto insurance? How is this developing? I at least am seeing so much more interest. It's kind of a weird take when, something blows up, people come to us and want to talk to us. So it's a weird predicament to be in. But yeah, what do you think about the crypto insurance landscape?
Yeah, I mean, there's no generator of insurance demand like a hurricane coming and knocking everyone's houses down, right? So, I think that people are of a mindset right now where they are maybe a bit more risk averse or a bit more risk off than they were the last couple of years, right? When number go up is kind of the prevailing thing. People are like, oh, whatever, insurance, I don't care, right? Like, that's dumb. Why would I even bother, right? But I think that we are in a position now where people are like, oh, now I get why that's a thing, right? And so the kind of pennies drop a little bit. So in terms of, and Dan and I talked about this, I think, when we first sort of discussed this, right? Like, I'm, I guess, like somewhat of an insurance skeptic, right? In terms of how you actually take insurance and put it into an environment where we just don't understand the risks, right? Now, I say skeptic in the sense of, like, for today. Right. For 10 years from now, no, like, obviously the market will get more efficient. We'll understand risk and all that sort of stuff. But, even like FTX, right? Like, if you'd said to me, like, what is the probability that SBF, I was on a bunch of podcasts with SBF, and what is the probability that FTX is a giant Ponzi scheme? I would have been like, well, it's crypto, so it can't be zero, but I would have said zero anyway because I'm an idiot, right? And so I would have been like, well, it's obviously zero. Like, it's just not a thing, right? And so when you have an environment that is so crazy and so adversarial, the question then is, like, how do you actually ensure that in an efficient manner? Now, I'm sure, we can get there. Like, there's no question we will get there. It's just, for me, the kind of skepticism, I guess, is like, how do we do that today? And I remember having the first conversation with Dan, and I was like, I don't really know what the hell this guy's talking about, but, like, he seems pretty credible. And, like, if someone's going to do it, it's going to be someone that comes with domain expertise from outside. Right. Like, there's certain things where you're like, okay, we can reinvent this from scratch in crypto, and we might, if enough of us do enough weird things, one of them will work. Right. Insurance, to me, feels like it's not one of those things where it's just going to be like some weird crypto version. We can reinvent a lot of things in crypto, but this one just didn't feel like it was going to be amenable to that. And so, talking to Dan, I was like, oh, okay, like, this is someone who's got domain expertise, who's coming in and trying to cryptofy it versus, hey, insurance, I know that word, let's build it from the ground up, right? They're both interesting approaches to the problem, but I do feel like the kind of coming from the outside and making it crypto in the long term is likely to win out.
We're still met with that criticism, especially, from the traditional insurance players. It's just like, wow, there's not enough data. I'm like, that's all we have is data. It's all on chain. Like, we should be able to map this pretty well. But yeah, I think with event, in insurance across the board, it usually is a major event happens and then insurance products are created. And so, yeah, it's sucks for the industry. There are black eyes on the crypto industry, but it does help us to, show that use case more and more and show the real benefits that crypto could have, from insurance.
Yeah, I feel like there's an interesting dichotomy as well when you talk about, being the crazy versus being, the steady Eddie. And, we're a fully regulated business. We have, this kind of sophistication piece, dare I say, boring, approach to some of the ways that we do things, certainly in comparison to, some of the crazy projects that you see in the crypto space. But in terms of the insurance industry, we are as crazy as it gets. And, it's almost trying to, and I think, largely successfully, trying to show these traditional guys that move at a pace that is impressively slow, that you're actually not a huge step away from being able to operate in a, very new, efficient way. And so you're constantly creating these, these bridges or, bits of education or, different types of technologies to just get a little bit closer to the way that they operate. Because, I really don't think that the insurance industry is as far away from operating in this, transparent, very, very efficient, tradable manner, using this kind of technology. And some of the bigger, more traditional insurance players who are really leading the way there, yes, it's taken them, 2 or 3 years to, get through compliance, to hold tokens and own wallets and, understand multi-sig and get that all signed off. But as soon as that's done, which we're starting to see an exponential, move there, then, suddenly you have the biggest players in the traditional space using this kind of technology. And insurance is a game of large numbers. So, these aren't small projects, that they're working on. These have been, multiple year, multiple growing teams. Some of the teams I've been speaking to started off as teams of one. Oh yeah, I was hired to, think about digital assets and, whatever. And now they're running teams of 20, 30 within their organizations, and they have full buy-in from legal and compliance, and they're not coming to do small things. So yeah, we get to be the cool, sexy, crazy one on one side, and then put people
stable, boring on the other side. Yeah. Well, yeah. So I think that is something that is maybe less obvious, on the outside, right? Like even to your average degen, right? When each cycle there's this kind of irrational exuberant phase, right? Where like someone somewhere in an organization is like, we have to deal with, blockchain or digital assets or whatever the thing is, right? And it gets some momentum, and people start doing stuff internally. They get, they build up teams, they start investing things, and it's hard to turn a big ship, right? And so even when crypto inevitably crashes 6 months later, a lot of these things kind of just keep going. The company might not be on Bloomberg talking about their, digital asset play anymore, right? But the team of 30 people that's, in the basement that's cranking away at it probably keeps going, right? Now some stuff gets shut down, but a lot of stuff just builds momentum and keeps going. And then magically when, the market comes back, those people have been grinding away in obscurity, and now people are like, do we have a blockchain idea? And it's like, oh yeah, those guys in the basement, they've been there for 3 years, right? And they're like, all right, now's the time to nail it. So I think that, when we come out the other side of this market, there's going to be a lot of that sort of stuff that's going on.
Yeah, no, for sure. Our previous podcast with Kevin, he said it really well when, the kind of 2018 bust, there was really just nothing to do. Whereas this current, let's call it a bear market, there's all sorts of things still going on, and all sorts of activity and a tremendous amount of building, which obviously was going on, but usage is so different this time around. Not that bull and bear markets are totally easy to track, so we don't know where things are going, but yeah, it does feel very different. Last one for me, really. We're interested to know how much thought Synthetix or you yourself, overlapped with any regulatory conversations. How did you guys think about that, if at all? And how do you see that going forwards? Obviously, that more pure decentralized play. I always find that conversation fascinating.
Yeah, I think I remember sitting in our lawyer's office, right, in late 2018, and we just launched Synthetix, and we're sitting in this tower, right, and it's this big office tower. They're expensive lawyers or whatever. We ended up deciding that we didn't want to spend as much money on lawyers, so we decentralized. But we were looking across town, right? This is in Sydney, and you're looking across town, and the regulator is you can literally see their office over there, right? And I'm like, if this thing works, at the time, I think the Synthetix market cap was $5 million or something like that, right? And I was like, if this thing works, at some point, someone is going to turn around and be like, wait a second, there's this multi-billion-dollar, derivatives platform that's operating here. What do we do with that, right? And if you were a centralized company running as a for-profit, and we never were that, we were an open source software foundation, but at some point someone can start to poke holes and things and be like, well, hang on a second, you got an office and niche and whatever. And we just looked at that and said, it may be fine. And it turned out that it actually kind of was fine, that regulators were fairly permissive here, and they were really going after fraud and, outright scams and things that were genuinely innovative. They were kind of happy to let them play out and let those experiments play out. So we got lucky in Australia, I think. Obviously in the US, it was a bit more adversarial, but even still, it wasn't like, armed raids or something of offices, right? Like it was, generally scams and things like that were being shut down. Now it's gotten much worse, but, 2018, 2019 wasn't as bad as it could have been. But I remember just thinking, like, we don't want to even think through the potential adverse scenario, right? Of like, some person freaks out and goes, shut all this down, and so we kind of looked at, I guess the precedent that had been set by this like sufficiently decentralized kind of argument that was made about Ethereum, right? And why that didn't need to be regulated. And obviously that was a US jurisdictional thing, but, we figured that, other regulators are going to be looking at what the US was doing and kind of, playing from their lead. And so we just said, we have to decentralize this thing. It's too risky to not decentralize it. We have to do it. And so, from basically the start of 2019, we started kind of, removing all of that stuff. And I think this is, I was going to make this point around governance earlier, but I'll make it now. Like, decentralizing governance is not just regulatory arbitrage. It has that component as well, but it is genuinely also about like efficiency of decision making. The idea that like some single person, in a like as a CEO or whatever, chairman of the board or whatever you want to call it, in this top-down hierarchical thing, this genius person is going to be able to make like the best decisions and just let that kind of propagate through this organization, is, in my view, a relic of that was the only thing we had. So people were like, oh, well, it has to be amazing. That's the only tool we have, right? So like, of course it has to be great. You can't live in a world where you're like, this is a terrible, inefficient thing, but it's all we've got. So, like it's hard to, like that level of kind of cognitive dissonance is hard to maintain. So people are like, no, this is the best thing. Like, of course, this is amazing, right? And so I think we now have a way of coordinating people in the form of decentralized organizations that are messy right now, but it's heading in the direction of better decision making. More open, more transparent, more, kind of, efficient decision making. Not in the sense that it's fast or you can like, pivot quickly or all that sort of stuff, but in that you don't do the dumb things as much. And that's really like ultimately at the crux of why decentralized governance for me is a better solution, is that it actually slows you down and kind of forces you to think things through and be a little bit, less crazy. Now, early on in an organization, you want people to do dumb, crazy stuff and blow up, and you have 10 of those things running in parallel, and one of them works, and then, you kind of, but at a certain point you need to transition. And so I have no issue with like 3 people in a garage, building a startup. But then after 6 months, it's like, okay, let's start to decentralize this. And I think we've seen now that in spite of all of the inefficiencies and all the friction, all that sort of stuff, that a lot of these decentralized organizations are starting to actually make better decisions. I mean, you look sort of historically at it versus a centralized organization, they're not blowing up. They're, they're kind of getting to the right decision eventually, and it's looking better and better. And I think that track record over the next 5 to 10 years is just going to get better. So I do think that, there is a regulatory arbitrage component to it, but that's not the whole story. The whole story is about how do you, kind of efficiently coordinate people. And I think we're here because we believe that, decentralization has some role to play in that.
Right. Yeah. And hopefully the product of more ideas as well.
Yeah, more idea. I was just going to say incentives are better aligned. It's no longer just that CEO, that board member, getting rich off the backs of its employees, or, the employees maybe not caring as much just because, well, it's not my company, it's not my money, better aligned incentives because everyone is a participant. Maybe it's through your token or, just the fact that you can get validation of your ideas from the community rather than just like your one manager one step above you, and then they take it to their one manager above as well.
Yeah, I mean, I say this all the time, right? Like, in crypto in a really decentralized crypto project, right? The office building that you operate is typically Discord, right? And any lunatic can just walk in, for good or ill, any lunatic can just walk in and sit down at a table and be like, what are we talking about today, guys? Like, that's just not like how the real world works, right? You can't walk into, Lloyd's and be like, hey guys, so I don't know if I'm like in agreement about how you guys are approaching this. Like, it's just not a thing, like they'll throw you out the door in 2 seconds, right? Whereas in crypto, you can turn up, and yes, a lot of them are lunatics, right? And make no sense. But, occasionally someone walks in and they're like, hey, I've got a really good idea. And if you listen to that person, you're like, oh, wow, actually, that is a good idea. We hadn't thought about that, right? And it can kind of send you in a different direction. So the idea that like anyone can walk in, anyone can participate, that is extremely powerful.
Yeah, we'll try and walk into the Lloyd's of London Discord and give a few.
You think they'll give me an internship or something if I wanted to go in and see how it works?
Hey, I'm willing to work for free. Like, let me in. I'll be like, get the fuck out of here.
All right. Well, as always, we want to wrap and hear from you. What is the missing link in crypto, and how does it accelerate that next wave of adoption in the space?
Yeah, I think last cycle, the Altel one sucked a lot of the oxygen out of the room, unfortunately, for a bunch of reasons. But I think we, even with the Coinbase announcement today of, this kind of optimism, powered L2, as part of this like super chain of L2s. I think we are finally in a place where Ethereum, it can kind of credibly scale. And when we do have that next influx of attention, it will go toward, it will be allocated inefficiently, as it always is, but it will be allocated inefficiently towards something that is credible, as opposed to towards a lot of things that are just nonsense. So I think that, over time, markets get more efficient, and I think crypto is getting more efficient. And I hope that in this next cycle that, that's what we see. And you're going to be in a place where we can actually offer people decentralized solutions to the things that they want to do. You can sit here and say like, oh, decentralization is great, but we actually can't do any of the things that you want. No one's going to listen to that. They're just going to go and give their money to, some scammer, right? Like, in absence of like a genuine solution, they will go and the market will find a way to take that person's money, right? So, it's really critical for us to have all of the infrastructure, all of the things that people are going to want. And I think that we're really getting close. And by the time, we do get into the next bull market, I'm pretty confident that we'll be there.
That's great. I feel like the space has done a great job of keeping people's attention for a decade, keeping the world's attention for that long to get to that point where these things can really become extremely useful, and some of the the early promise starts to manifest pretty quickly. So that's great to hear.
And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real honor to have a crypto OG on our podcast so early on. So we appreciate it. And, thank you for being just such a great proponent of, open, transparent markets. And yeah, a guest on the show.
Thanks.
Thank you. Cheers, Kain.
Thanks for having me.
We're one step closer to finding the missing link. If you enjoy our show, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcast. And be sure to come back next month. Until then, we are the missing link.